The heavy rain pounded against the cracked windshield of the rusted 1988 Ford pickup, like a relentless judge handing down a harsh sentence. Inside the freezing cabin, Elias Hayes, known to everyone in the Texas music circuit simply as Dusty, sat perfectly still. Water leaked through the worn weather stripping, dripping onto the dashboard where a stack of past-due medical bills sat next to a bright pink foreclosure notice. The engine had given out 10 miles outside of Austin on the desolate shoulder of Interstate 35. The smell of burnt oil mixed with the damp, earthy scent of the Texas storm. Dusty gripped the cracked steering wheel, his calloused, aging hands trembling, not from the bitter cold, but from the crushing weight of a broken promise. He had given his entire life, his sweat, and his soul to the traditional country music he believed in, and now, stranded in the dark, with a sick wife waiting at home, it felt like the world had finally turned its back on him. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythmic thud of the rain, wondering how he was going to survive the night. To understand how a master of the pedal steel guitar ended up broken down on the side of a highway with nothing but lint in his pockets, one had to look back to the suffocating heat of San Marcos just a few months prior. It was a time when the entire landscape of country music was shifting beneath the boots of the men who built it. The industry executives in Nashville and the bankers in Dallas had made a cold, calculated decision. Traditional country was dead. The fiddles, the steel guitars, the raw, honest storytelling of the working man were no longer profitable. They wanted pop beats, slick hair, and empty lyrics. They wanted a product, not a soul. George Strait stood in the center of a cramped, rented rehearsal space in San Marcos, the oppressive Texas heat radiating from the asphalt outside and seeping through the thin walls. The air conditioning unit in the window had died 3 days ago, leaving the room smelling of old wood, stale coffee, and anxious sweat. George, the stoic cowboy with a quiet faith and an unshakable moral compass, listened in silence as the men he had played with for years delivered the fatal blows. One by one, the members of his backing band packed up their instruments. They avoided his eyes, staring down at the scuffed floorboards. They had families. They had mortgages. The executives in the glass towers had cut the funding for George's upcoming tour and his new album, declaring his authentic sound a financial liability. The studio musicians were offered lucrative, safe contracts to play behind the new pop country stars, and fear drove them to accept. George did not raise his voice. He did not beg them to stay. He possessed a deep, ingrained Texas dignity, a profound understanding of the burdens men carried. He simply tipped his white Stetson, shook each of their hands, and wished them well. He knew that loyalty could not be bought, and he refused to hold a man hostage to a sinking ship. As the door clicked shut behind the last departing musician, the silence in the sweltering room became deafening. George walked over to the corner, slowly unlatching the worn leather case of his acoustic guitar. He looked at the instrument, the wood polished by years of dedication, and for a fleeting moment, the heavy burden of defeat settled onto his broad shoulders. He bowed his head, saying a silent prayer for guidance, accepting that perhaps this chapter was closing. Then, a sound broke the silence. It was the distinct metallic clink of a heavy steel bar hitting metal strings. George turned around. In the darkest, hottest corner of the room, Dusty Hayes was methodically setting up his pedal steel guitar. Dusty was a man who wore his hard life on his face. Deep lines etched around his eyes told stories of endless miles on dusty roads, of cheap motels, and of a profound, unwavering love for his ailing wife, Martha. His boots were scuffed, the leather cracked from years of exposure to the elements. George walked slowly toward him, the sound of his own boots echoing in the empty room. He looked at the older man, knowing full well the mountain of debt Dusty was facing at home. Dusty did not look up immediately. He carefully tuned the highest string, the mournful, weeping note filling the stifling air. Finally, he met George's eyes. There was no fear in Dusty's gaze, only a quiet, burning resolve. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "I do not play for record label money, George," Dusty said, his voice raspy and low, carrying the grit of the Texas plains. "I play for respect. I play because this music means something, and we have a record to make." George stared at him for a long moment. He saw the stack of pharmacy receipts peeking out of Dusty's shirt pocket. He knew the sacrifice this man was making. In a world driven by greed and self-preservation, Dusty was choosing the hard path of loyalty. George gave a slow, deliberate nod. A silent pact was forged in that sweltering room, a covenant between two men who believed that integrity was worth more than gold. The weeks that followed were a grueling test of human endurance. Unable to afford a proper studio or a full band, George and Dusty rented a dilapidated, tin-roofed shack on the outskirts of town that had been converted into a makeshift recording booth. They worked 18 hours a day. The heat was relentless, turning the small room into an oven. Dusty pushed himself beyond the limits of his aging body. Because they had no bass player, no rhythm guitarist, and no drummer, Dusty used every ounce of his genius to fill the void. He manipulated the pedals of his steel guitar to create deep, resonant bass lines. He strummed the strings with a heavy hand to mimic the percussive drive of a drum kit. His fingers blistered, bled, and calloused over again. George sang with a raw, bleeding emotion he had never tapped into before. He sang for the forgotten working class, for the farmers praying for rain, and for the loyal friend sitting across from him, bleeding onto the strings. They survived on black coffee, stale sandwiches, and a shared, unspoken faith that God honors honest work. They were David facing Goliath, armed with nothing but a steel guitar and a microphone. 1,000 miles away, in the towering glass cathedrals of Nashville, Richard Vance sat in his climate-controlled office, wearing a bespoke Italian suit and sipping sparkling water. Vance was the architect of the new country movement, a man who viewed music entirely through the lens of profit margins and focus groups. He despised the dirt, the dust, and the simple faith of the Texas country scene. When he heard rumors that George Strait was recording an independent acoustic album in a shack, he laughed. Vance made a few strategic phone calls to the major radio conglomerates, ensuring that no station under his influence would dare play a single track from the rogue project. He intended to starve George out, to break his spirit and force him to return crawling, ready to sing whatever manufactured pop garbage the label put in front of him. Back in Texas, the album was finally finished. It was a masterpiece of raw, unfiltered emotion. George pressed a limited run of CDs using his own depleted savings, mailing them out to independent radio stations across the country. And then, they waited. Days turned into weeks. The silence from the industry was absolute. The major stations refused to touch it. The bank accounts dwindled to nothing, which brought Dusty to this exact moment, sitting in his dead truck under the torrential downpour on Interstate 35. The cold seeped into his bones. He looked at the pink foreclosure notice on the dashboard. He had gambled everything on loyalty, on the belief that good music and good men still mattered in this world, and he had lost. His wife needed her medication. He did not even have the cash to call a tow truck. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the pink slip of paper, the harsh reality of his failure crushing his chest. Suddenly, the old cracked screen of his flip phone lit up on the passenger seat. It was George. Dusty stared at the glowing screen. He felt a profound sense of shame. He did not want to answer. He did not want to hear the resignation in his friend's voice, to share the mutual acknowledgement that the corporate giants had won. But the code of the West, the deep respect he held for the man on the other end of the line, forced him to pick it up. He flipped the phone open, bringing it to his ear. The sound of the rain hammering the roof of the truck almost drowned out his voice. "Hello, George," Dusty said, his voice cracking, betraying the exhaustion and despair consuming him. "Dusty, where are you?" George's voice came through the static, calm, steady, and anchoring. "My truck finally gave up the ghost, George. I'm out on 35, raining like the days of Noah." Dusty closed his eyes, a single tear mixing with the cold sweat on his face. "George, I am looking at a piece of paper that says the bank is taking my house. I gave it everything I had, I really did, but I think we reached the end of the road." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Dusty could hear the faint sound of a radio playing in the background of George's end. "Dusty," George said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that made the older man hold his breath. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not losing your house. You are not losing anything. I am coming to get you right now, but before I hang up, I want you to turn your radio on. My truck is dead, George. The battery is barely holding on. Turn it on to AM 800, Dusty, just do it. Dusty reached out with a shaking hand. He turned the key halfway. The dashboard lights flickered weakly. He pressed the power button on the old radio receiver. Static filled the freezing cabin. He turned the dial, the crackling noise harsh against his ears, until the frequency locked onto the small independent AM station out of Amarillo. The static cleared, and there, cutting through the dark, cold night, was the unmistakable, weeping sound of his own pedal steel guitar. It was the opening track of their album. Dusty froze, his breath hitched in his throat. The radio DJ, a man with a gravelly voice who sounded like he had smoked 2 packs a day for 30 years, spoke over the fading outro of the song. "Folks," the DJ said, his voice vibrating with genuine emotion, "I have been sitting in this booth for 25 years. I have seen the suits in Nashville try to bury the soul of our music, but they cannot bury this. The phone lines have been jammed for 3 straight hours. Truck drivers, night shift nurses, farmers out in the panhandle. You are all calling in for the exact same thing. This is the real deal. This is the heartbeat of Texas." Dusty sat in the freezing, dark cabin of his broken-down truck, the pink foreclosure notice falling from his trembling fingers. The rain continued to pound against the glass, but he no longer felt the cold. He listened to the sound of his own calloused hands making magic over the airwaves, realizing that the fire they had started in that sweltering, broken-down studio was finally catching the wind. The blinding glare of headlights pierced the relentless Texas downpour, illuminating the rusted shell of Dusty Hayes' broken truck. George Strait pulled his heavy-duty dually pickup onto the muddy shoulder, the massive tires crunching over gravel and debris. He threw the transmission into park, grabbed a thick canvas raincoat from the back seat, and stepped out into the storm. The cold rain instantly lashed at his face, but George did not hurry. His strides were long, measured, and purposeful, his leather boots sinking into the thick mud. He walked up to the passenger side of the dead Ford and pulled the heavy metal door open. The hinges screamed in protest. Inside, Dusty looked like a man who had been hollowed out by the world. His hands still gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes staring blankly at the glowing dial of the radio, where his own steel guitar was weeping through the static. George leaned into the freezing cabin. He did not offer empty platitudes or loud congratulations. He simply reached out, his large hand calloused from years of gripping reins and guitar necks, and rested it firmly on Dusty's trembling shoulder. "Let us go home, brother," George said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the howling wind. Dusty slowly turned his head. His eyes were red, brimming with tears he was too proud to let fall. He looked down at the pink foreclosure notice resting on his lap, the paper now damp from the humidity. He picked it up, his fingers shaking, and offered it to George like a confession of his own failure. "They are taking the house, George," Dusty whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "Martha needs her medicine. I do not have a dime to my name. I heard the song on the radio. I heard it. But a song does not pay the bank by tomorrow morning." George took the damp pink slip from Dusty's trembling fingers. He did not look at it. He crumpled it into a tight ball in his fist and tossed it out into the muddy ditch where the rain quickly swallowed it. "That piece of paper means absolutely nothing," George said, his gaze locked onto Dusty's defeated eyes. "You stood by me when every other man in this state ran for cover. You bled onto those strings in 100-degree heat because you believed in the truth of what we were doing. God sees that kind of loyalty, Dusty, and I see it. Now grab your gear. You are not spending another second in the cold." The ride back to Dusty's modest home in the hill country was wrapped in a profound, heavy silence. The heater in George's truck blasted warm air, slowly thawing the ice in Dusty's bones. Outside the windows, the storm raged on, but inside the cab, there was a sanctuary of unspoken brotherhood. When they finally pulled into the cracked concrete driveway of Dusty's small, single-story home, the porch light was already on, a fragile beacon in the dark. Martha Hayes stood behind the screen door. She was a woman whose beauty had been weathered by years of illness and financial terror, yet her spine was straight, her spirit unbroken. She wore a faded cotton dressing gown, clutching a woven shawl around her frail shoulders. As Dusty stepped out of the truck, His head hung low in shame of his broken-down vehicle, and his empty pockets. Martha pushed the screen door open. She did not look at the mud on his boots. She looked at the man she had loved for 40 years, the man who had played his fingers to the bone for a dream. George walked up the wooden steps behind Dusty, removing his Stetson out of deep respect as he stepped onto the porch. "Evening, Miss Martha," George said, his tone gentle, holding his hat over his chest. "I apologize for keeping him out so late in this weather." Martha looked at George, her eyes shining with a mixture of immense gratitude and deep sorrow. She knew the sacrifices her husband had made for this man. She knew about the empty bank accounts and the terrifying letters from the creditors. But she also knew the integrity of the man standing on her porch. "Come inside, George," Martha said softly, stepping aside. "I have coffee on the stove." They sat around a small, scratched formica kitchen table. The smell of cheap, dark roast coffee filled the humble room. The ticking of an old wall clock echoed in the silence. George wrapped his large hands around the warm ceramic mug, looking at the couple sitting across from him. He saw the way Dusty held Martha's fragile hand under the table, a desperate, protective grip. "Martha," George began, choosing his words with the careful precision of a man who understands the weight of a promise. "I know the burden Dusty has carried these past few months. I know the burden you have carried. The industry folks in Nashville tried to bury us. They tried to starve us out because we refused to sell our souls to their machines. But the wind changed tonight." He looked at Dusty, then back to Martha. "I heard our song on the radio tonight," George continued, his voice steady, carrying the quiet conviction of a preacher delivering a sermon. "And it was not just playing, it was breathing. The people are waking up. I cannot promise you that the road ahead will be easy. But I give you my word as a Christian and as a Texan, I will not let this man fall. I will not let you lose this home." Over the next 3 weeks, the spark that ignited in that small Amarillo radio station turned into an uncontrollable, raging wildfire across the American heartland. The phenomenon was organic, raw, and entirely unprecedented in the modern corporate music era. Truck drivers hauling freight across the lonely stretches of Interstate 40 blasted the cassette tapes from their cabs, the weeping sound of Dusty's steel guitar echoing into the desert nights. Waitresses in small-town diners dropped quarters into jukeboxes just to hear George's authentic, unpolished voice singing about their daily struggles. The music smelled of fresh-cut hay, tasted like cold beer after a hard day's work, and felt like a warm embrace from an old friend. The independent stations could not play it enough. The major radio conglomerates, the ones who had sworn allegiance to the pop country executives in Nashville, began bleeding listeners by the thousands. Local sponsors pulled their advertising dollars, demanding that the stations play the George Strait record that everyone in town was talking about. The pressure became insurmountable. One by one, the corporate walls crumbled. The song breached the mainstream airwaves, climbing the Billboard charts with a terrifying, unstoppable momentum. It went gold in a matter of weeks, then platinum, then double platinum. 1,000 miles away, on the 40th floor of a towering glass skyscraper on Music Row in Nashville, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air smelled of expensive espresso, imported cologne, and raw, unadulterated panic. Richard Vance stood by his floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city he believed he owned. His bespoke Italian suit felt tight around his shoulders. His pristine, polished leather shoes paced nervously across the imported Persian rug. His desk was littered with sales reports, demographic analyses, and frantic memos from the board of directors. The manufactured pop country stars he had poured millions of dollars into were failing to generate even a fraction of the revenue that George Independent Acoustic Record was pulling in. The public had rejected the plastic product. They wanted the dirt, the dust, and the soul. They wanted George Strait. Vance's assistant, a pale young man clutching a clipboard, stood trembling by the heavy mahogany door. "Sir?" the assistant stammered. "The distributors in Europe are calling again. They want the international rights to the Strait album. The board of directors is demanding a meeting by tomorrow morning. They want to know why we do not own the distribution rights to the biggest country record of the decade." Vance slammed his fist against the reinforced glass of the window, his face contorted in a mask of rage and humiliation. He had underestimated the cowboy. He had underestimated the loyalty of the working class, And now his own job was on the line. He took a deep, shaky breath, smoothing his silk tie, trying to regain the cold, calculating composure that had built his career. "Get him on the phone," Vance ordered, his voice dripping with venom. "Find out what rock he is hiding under in Texas and get George Strait on the phone right now." Hundreds of miles away, the Texas sun was beginning to set over the rolling hills of George Ranch, casting long golden shadows across the dry earth. The air was thick with the smell of sweetgrass and the faint, dusty scent of horses. George was standing by a wooden fence wearing worn leather work gloves, methodically repairing a broken rail. He wore no jewelry, no flashy clothes, just a faded denim shirt and his battered white Stetson. He was a man entirely at peace with his surroundings. His ranch manager walked out from the main house holding a cordless phone. "George," the manager called out. "It is Nashville. A man named Richard Vance says it is an absolute emergency." George did not rush. He slowly hammered the last nail into the wooden rail, testing its strength with his gloved hand. He took off his gloves, slapping them against his thigh to knock off the dust, and took the phone. "Speak," George said, his voice as calm and flat as a still lake. "George, my friend." Vance's voice erupted through the receiver, dripping with a manufactured, desperate enthusiasm. "It has been too long. I have been listening to the new record, George. It is a masterpiece. I always knew you had it in you. We all did. The whole label is just thrilled for your success." George looked out at the horizon, watching a hawk circle in the orange sky. He remained completely silent, letting Vance's empty words hang in the air, dying of their own weight. The silence stretched on, becoming agonizing for the executive in the glass tower. Vance cleared his throat, his artificial confidence wavering. "Listen, George," Vance continued, his tone shifting to a rapid, business-like cadence. "We made some miscalculations in the past, we admit that, but we are ready to bring you back into the family. We have the infrastructure to take this record global. We are talking multi-million-dollar distribution deals, stadium tours, merchandise. I need you to fly up to Nashville tomorrow. We have a contract ready. We want to make you the king of this label again." "I will be there on Tuesday," George said quietly, "and I am bringing my steel guitar player with me." Vance let out a dismissive, arrogant laugh. "George, you do not need to bring the hired help to a corporate negotiation. We will cut the old man a standard session check, clear the union paperwork, and send him on his way. This meeting is for the big boys. We are talking about generational wealth here." George felt a cold, righteous anger tighten in his chest, but his voice never betrayed it. "Tuesday at noon, Vance," George replied. "Have your board of directors present." He pressed the button to end the call, handing the phone back to his manager. He looked back out at the vast, open land, a silent vow forming in his heart. The men in the glass towers thought they could buy his soul with a piece of paper. They thought they could discard the man who had bled for him in the trenches. They were about to learn a very hard lesson about the code of the West. On Tuesday morning, the private jet chartered by the record label touched down on the pristine tarmac of Nashville International Airport. Dusty Hayes stepped off the plane, clutching the worn handle of his guitar case as if it were a life preserver. He wore his best pearl snap shirt, freshly ironed by Martha, and his boots had been polished to the best of his ability, but the deep scuffs and cracks still showed. He looked at the towering skyline of the city, feeling a crushing wave of inadequacy. He was just a session player, a man who had spent his life in the shadows of dimly lit stages and smoky bars. He did not belong in the world of Armani suits, private jets, and million-dollar negotiations. He felt like a lamb walking willingly into a den of wolves. George walked beside him, a towering pillar of calm strength. He wore a crisp white shirt, a dark blazer, and his signature Stetson, his posture perfectly straight. He noticed the tremor in Dusty's hand, the nervous sweat beading on the older man's forehead. "Breathe, Dusty," George said softly, not breaking his stride as they walked through the terminal. "George, I do not know about this," Dusty whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. "These people, they eat guys like me for breakfast. They have lawyers that cost more than my house. Maybe I should just wait in the lobby. You go in there, you get your deal, you deserve it. I'm just glad the record is doing well." George stopped walking. He turned to face Dusty, ignoring the busy crowds rushing past them. He looked directly into the older man's fearful eyes. "You listen to me, Elias Hayes," George said, using Dusty's given name, a sign of profound respect. "You did not wait in the lobby when the money ran out in San Marcos. You did not wait in the lobby when my band walked out on me. You sat in a boiling room and played until your fingers bled. We did not come to Nashville to ask for their permission. We came to collect what is rightfully yours. Now, hold your head up. You are the heart of that record. Do not let these suits make you forget who you are." Dusty swallowed hard, drawing strength from the unwavering conviction in George's eyes. He tightened his grip on his guitar case, nodded slowly, and stood a little taller. They arrived at the towering glass skyscraper on Music Row. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and chrome, designed to intimidate anyone who walked through its doors. They rode the silent, high-speed elevator up to the 40th floor. The doors slid open to reveal an expansive reception area that smelled of expensive orchids and old money. A sleek secretary led them down a long hallway, the thick carpet silencing the sound of their boots. She opened a set of heavy, double oak doors, revealing the executive boardroom. The room was vast, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Nashville skyline. In the center of the room sat a massive mahogany table. Gathered around it were 12 executives, all dressed in immaculate, expensive suits. They were the architects of the industry, the men who decided who became a star and who faded into obscurity. At the head of the table sat Richard Vance, a predatory smile plastered across his face. The air in the room was thick with ambition, greed, and a palpable condescension as the executives looked at Dusty. They saw his scuffed boots, the deep lines on his face, the worn guitar case. To them, he was not an artist. He was a piece of obsolete machinery, a relic of a bygone era that they had to briefly tolerate before getting to the real business. "Welcome, gentlemen," Vance said, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of fake hospitality. "George, it is an honor to have you back where you belong. Please take a seat. Let us get this unpleasant paperwork out of the way so we can talk about your future." George pulled out a heavy leather chair for Dusty, ensuring the older man sat down before taking his own seat at the opposite end of the table from Vance. George placed his hands flat on the mahogany wood, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Vance snapped his fingers. His assistant scurried forward, placing a thin manila folder in front of Vance. The executive opened it, pulling out a single printed check. He did not look at Dusty. He looked only at George, his smile sharp and predatory. "Now, George," Vance said, his tone slick and patronizing. "Before we sign the multi-million-dollar distribution contracts for your brilliant new album, we need to clear the chain of title. The legal department needs to ensure that all freelance contractors who contributed to the unauthorized recording sessions are fully compensated and their rights are legally waived." Vance picked up the check. He looked at it with a smirk of absolute disdain, then slid it across the long, polished expanse of the mahogany table. The piece of paper glided over the wood, coming to a stop directly in front of Dusty. Dusty looked down. It was a check for $300, the absolute minimum standard union day rate for a disposable session musician. It was a calculated insult, a deliberate slap in the face meant to remind Dusty of his place at the bottom of the food chain. "There you go, old-timer," Vance said, leaning back in his expensive leather chair, clasping his hands together behind his head. $300. That covers your time in the studio. You sign the waiver attached to it, and you relinquish any and all claims to the masters, the royalties, and the publishing. Take it, buy your wife something nice, and let the adults handle the real business now." Dusty stared at the check. The $300 would barely cover half of Martha's medication for the month. The sheer injustice of it, the cold, clinical cruelty of these men who had done nothing but sit in air-conditioned rooms while he bled for the music, crushed the air from his lungs. The humiliation burned in his chest. He felt small, insignificant, and utterly defeated. With a trembling, calloused hand, Dusty slowly reached out toward the miserable scrap of paper, believing that this was the best a man like him could ever hope for in a world run by wolves. Dusty extended his calloused, trembling fingers toward the miserable $300 check, resting on the polished mahogany table. The air in the boardroom was thick with the suffocating smugness of the 12 executives. They watched him with the detached amusement of men who bought and sold human dreams before their morning coffee. Richard Vance leaned back in his expensive leather chair, a victorious, predatory smirk playing on his lips. He took a slow sip from his crystal water glass, fully expecting the old broken musician to take the crumbs, sign his life away, and disappear back into the dusty oblivion of Texas. Dusty felt the heat of shame rising in his cheeks. He thought of Martha, coughing in the dark, and knew he had no choice. His rough fingertips brushed the edge of the paper. Suddenly, a heavy, leather-clad arm crossed his field of vision. A large hand, scarred by barbed wire and tanned by the relentless southern sun, clamped down firmly over Dusty's wrist. The movement was not violent, but it possessed an immovable, terrifying weight. The entire room seemed to freeze. The ice clinking in Vance's glass stopped. The quiet hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounded like a roaring engine in the absolute, stunned silence. Dusty looked to his left. George Strait had not stood up. He had not raised his voice. He sat perfectly still, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed dead ahead. Slowly, George released Dusty's wrist and moved his hand over the check. He pressed his palm flat against the paper, dragging it away from Dusty's reach and pulling it toward himself. George looked down the length of the long mahogany table. His gaze locked onto Richard Vance. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Beneath the brim of his pristine white Stetson, George's eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a man who had drawn a line in the dirt and was daring anyone in the room to cross it. "Excuse me, gentlemen," George said. His voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated against the expensive wood of the table. "I believe you have made a miscalculation." Vance lowered his water glass, his arrogant smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he forced it back into place. He let out a patronizing chuckle, looking around the table at his fellow executives for support. "Now, George, let us not make this complicated," Vance said, his tone slick with false camaraderie. "We understand Elias here did a fine job filling in, but the union scale is the union scale. We are offering him top-tier session rates. We have a multi-million-dollar promotional campaign waiting for your signature. Let us just get this housekeeping out of the way." George did not blink. He picked up the check. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, inspecting it as if it were a piece of filth he had scraped off the bottom of his boot. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, George ripped the check in half. The tearing sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent boardroom. Several executives physically flinched in their seats. Vance sat bolt upright, his face flushing a deep, angry red. George placed the two halves together and tore them again, reducing the corporate insult to 4 jagged pieces of worthless paper. He opened his hand, letting the pieces flutter down onto the imported Persian rug. "Have you lost your mind, Strait?" Vance snapped, the polished veneer finally cracking to reveal the panicked bureaucrat underneath. "You cannot just tear up a legal tender offer. That man is a session player. He is an employee." "This man," George interrupted, his voice rising just enough to cut through Vance's panic like a hunting knife, "is not an employee." George reached down and unlatched his weathered leather briefcase, the brass buckles clicking sharply. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, bound in a heavy blue folder. He tossed the folder onto the center of the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped directly in front of Vance. "This man is the reason we are sitting at this table," George continued, his voice echoing with the righteous fury of the working class. "When you men in your fine suits decided that my music was not worth your money, when you cut my funding and told me I was finished, you all ran for the hills. Every single musician on your payroll packed their bags and left me in an empty room. But Dusty Hayes stayed. He stayed when he had nothing. He played until his hands bled. He built the soul of this record while you sat in this tower counting your pennies." Vance stared at the blue folder, a bead of cold sweat forming on his temple. He looked at the other executives who were now shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, avoiding George's piercing gaze. "I had my lawyers in Austin draft that up yesterday," George said, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Dusty does not get a session fee. He does not get a buyout. Dusty gets 20% of the total gross royalties of the master recording. He gets 20% of the publishing. And he gets a co-producer credit on every single copy of that album sold anywhere in the world." The room erupted into chaos. The executives began shouting over each other. Vance slammed his hand on the table, his face purple with rage. "That is impossible," Vance yelled, his voice cracking. "That is unprecedented. We do not give 20% of the masters to a steel guitar player. The label owns the masters. We are offering you a $50 million distribution deal, George. Do not throw your career away over some misplaced sense of charity for an old man who cannot even afford a decent pair of boots." George stood up. He rose slowly, his towering frame dominating the room. The shouting instantly died down. The sheer physical presence of the cowboy, fueled by a lifetime of hard labor and unshakable principles, forced the men in the suits to shrink back into their expensive leather chairs. "You seem to be confused about who holds the cards in this room, Vance," George said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You do not own the masters. I paid for the studio time. I paid for the pressing. I own the masters. You need me because the people out there, the people who actually buy the records and drive the trucks and work the fields, they chose us. They rejected your plastic product." George placed his large hands on the table, leaning closer to Vance, forcing the executive to look up at him. "So here is how this is going to work," George said, his words falling like heavy stones. "You're going to open that folder. You're going to sign on the dotted line. You're going to guarantee Dusty Hayes 20% of every dime this record makes for the rest of his natural life and the life of his wife. If you do not, I will pick up that folder. I will walk out that door, and I will take this platinum record, along with my entire back catalog, across the street to an independent distributor. I will bankrupt this label by Friday." The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. The air was so thick it felt hard to breathe. Vance looked at the blue folder. He looked at the faces of his board members. He saw the stark, undeniable truth in their eyes. If George Strait walked out that door, the label would lose its biggest asset. The stock would plummet. Vance would be fired before the end of the day. They had tried to break the cowboy, and instead, they had handed him the whip. Vance's hands were shaking as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. He opened the blue folder. He stared at the contract, his eyes scanning the aggressive terms drafted by ruthless Texas lawyers who knew exactly how to bleed a corporation dry. He swallowed hard, the taste of total defeat bitter in his mouth. Without saying a word, Vance pressed the pen to the paper. The scratching sound of the nib against the parchment was the only sound in the room. He signed his name, his signature jagged and rushed. He pushed the folder to the executive next to him, who quickly signed as a witness. The folder made its way around the table, a silent procession of surrender, until it arrived back in front of George. George picked up the folder. He reviewed the signatures carefully, taking his time, letting the executives stew in their humiliation. Satisfied, he closed the folder and slid it into his weathered briefcase. He snapped the brass buckles shut. George turned to Dusty, who was sitting frozen in his chair, his eyes wide, his breath caught in his throat. The older man looked as though he had just witnessed a miracle. "Grab your guitar, Dusty," George said softly, a faint, genuine smile finally touching his eyes. "We are done here." They walked out of the boardroom without looking back. They did not say goodbye. They rode the silent elevator down 40 floors, the descent feeling like a return from a hostile alien planet back to the solid Earth. When they pushed through the heavy glass doors of the lobby and stepped out onto the Nashville sidewalk, the bright midday sun hit them. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and hot asphalt, but to Dusty, it smelled like absolute freedom. Dusty stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. He dropped his heavy guitar case. His knees suddenly felt weak. The adrenaline that had kept him upright in the boardroom evaporated, leaving behind a tidal wave of overwhelming emotion. He thought about the pink foreclosure notice rotting in the mud on Interstate 35. He thought about Martha's medical bills. He thought about the 20% royalty on a double platinum album. He was a millionaire. His wife was safe. His home was safe. Tears, hot and fast, spilled over Dusty's weathered cheeks. He did not try to wipe them away. He turned to George, his chest heaving, his voice choked with a gratitude so profound it physically hurt. "George," Dusty stammered, his rough hands reaching out to grasp George's arm. George, I do not know what to say. I do not know how to repay you. You just saved my life. You saved Martha's life. George stopped walking. He turned to face his friend, the bustling crowds of the city moving around them like a river around two deeply rooted stones. George reached up and adjusted the brim of his Stetson, shielding his eyes from the harsh sun. He reached out and placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Dusty's trembling shoulder. "You do not owe me a thing, brother," George said, his voice carrying the deep, resonant warmth of the Texas plains. "You played the first note, Dusty. I am just making sure you play the last." Time moves differently when a man is no longer running from the shadow of debt. Years melted away, carrying with them the bitter memories of broken-down trucks and freezing rain. The corporate executives in Nashville continued their endless game of chasing trends, but they never again dared to cross the men who built the foundation of the music. The Texas sun was beginning its slow descent over the sprawling expanse of the hill country, painting the sky in violent, beautiful strokes of orange, purple, and bruised red. The air was thick with the sweet smell of blooming bluebonnets and the earthy scent of a recent rainstorm. A long, winding driveway paved with crushed white limestone led up to a magnificent property. The fences were freshly painted white, holding back acres of lush green pasture where magnificent quarter horses grazed peacefully. At the entrance of the driveway, a heavy stone pillar held a custom wrought iron mailbox. Forged into the black metal were the words, "Hayes Ranch." The main house was a sprawling, beautiful structure built of native Texas limestone and rich cedar wood. A wide wrap-around porch encircled the home, offering a sanctuary from the intense afternoon heat. Sitting on a handcrafted wooden rocking chair was Elias Dusty Hayes. He wore a crisp, clean pearl snap shirt, and his boots, though still worn from use, were crafted of the finest leather. The deep lines of worry that had once scarred his face had softened, replaced by the quiet, dignified peace of a man who had fought the hardest battle of his life and won. The screen door creaked open, and Martha stepped out onto the porch. She moved with a grace and vitality that had been stolen from her years ago. The best doctors, the finest medicine, and the absence of crushing stress had restored the color to her cheeks and the bright spark to her eyes. She carried 2 glasses of sweet iced tea, the condensation dripping down the sides of the crystal. She walked over and handed a glass to Dusty, leaning down to press a soft kiss to his weathered cheek. He reached up, catching her hand, his thumb gently tracing her knuckles. He did not need to say a word. The love and gratitude between them was a living, breathing thing, forged in the fires of near ruin and cemented in the sanctuary of their new life. From inside the house, drifting through the open windows, came the sound of a high-end stereo system. It was playing a familiar tune. The weeping, mournful yet triumphant cry of a pedal steel guitar filled the evening air, followed by the smooth, steady, unshakable voice of George Strait. Dusty took a sip of the cold, sweet tea, leaning back in his rocking chair. He looked out over the vast, beautiful land that he now owned free and clear. He listened to the music that he had helped create in a boiling, broken-down shack so many years ago. He knew that the world was full of men who measured their worth by the balance in their bank accounts and the fear they could instill in others. He had faced those men in the glass towers, and he had seen how fragile their power truly was. But as he listened to the voice of his friend singing through the speakers, Dusty understood the profound truth of the journey they had taken. True wealth was never found in the ink of a contract or the sterile walls of a corporate boardroom. It was found in the mud of a flooded highway, in the blistering heat of a rented room, and in the quiet, unbreakable bond between men who refused to abandon each other when the storm raged its hardest. The music played on, echoing across the hills, a permanent, beautiful testament to the fact that when a man stands firm in his integrity, no amount of money or power can ever tear him down.